Herb Baker. He's a retired administrator at NASA, and he worked there for several years. And so I'm going to let Herb explain briefly his background, then we'll take some questions. Our chat is open, so if you feel free to send me a chat if you have questions as we go through. And then we'll get some of Herb's stories as we go. I anticipate this being about an hour long, so everyone we'll have a good time speaking about space flight, human space flight with Herb. So Herb, I'll let you take it away.
Okay, so first of all, administrator is the head of NASA. I was a manager. I just want to make sure no one thinks that I believed I was an administrator. So,
no, I didn't mean the NASA administrator, but yeah, I understand.
Yeah. Okay. So, but all that aside, I did work for NASA for 42 years and just retired. Well, it's been about 5 or 6 years ago now, but I still live just a few minutes from the Johnson Space Center, where I spent most of my career, but I also spent a year at the Kennedy Space Center and about 10 years at NASA headquarters in Washington, D.C. Worked on the shuttle program, the space station program, the Orion program, even for a couple of years. But I worked in the business office, so I was not a scientist or engineer or doctor. And actually, a lot of people don't realize that about 30 to 40% of NASA employees are, non-engineers and scientists. They're, HR and procurement and finance and business and now today IT and social media and all of those things. So there's lots of ways you can become involved with the space program without being a scientist or engineer. But the other thing I wanted to mention is I said I stay involved. I'm on the board of directors of the NASA Alumni League, which is, as it sounds, is a group of former NASA employees, including a lot of astronauts and flight directors and such, that a nonprofit, and our main focus is to promote STEM education. We provide funding to other organizations that have programs to promote STEM learning and education. So I'll cut it off at there, and we'll go to any questions you have.
Yeah. So why don't we start? We have a question from Awesome Sunset. Sandals Awesome Sunset. So let me play that. Yeah, I can get that there. Well, if I can. Sometimes these things are more challenging. Do you hear the question?
I'm sorry, what? I don't see or hear anything.
Hold on. Yeah. Okay. Well, let me get that. I'll ask the question that came from I'm gonna last name Mukherjee. And what is the most interesting thing that happened to you or happened while working at Johnson Space Center while you were working there?
Oh, wow. So many things come to mind over 30 something years. One that was fairly recent and might be something that some of the listeners can relate to. I was supporting flight operations, and so this was about 7 or 8 years ago. We were still flying back and forth to the space station on Russian Soyuz vehicles before SpaceX was involved in getting our astronauts back and forth. And so all of our astronauts had to fly back and forth to the station from Kazakhstan on a Russian Soyuz. And so obviously we had to go pick them up, take them there and pick them up and bring them back home. And we had an old Gulfstream that didn't have a long range, and so it had to make multiple stops on the way home. And as you can imagine, sometimes not just for the astronaut, but they were maybe bringing back an experiment or a sample or something. They were kind of in a hurry to get it back to Houston. And so it was a little bit annoying that, first of all, that it took multiple stops and more time to get home. And then we reached a point where they were having engine problems. So the head of flight operations called me into a meeting, and I look over and there's, the head of the astronaut office and Bob Benkin. Well, in fact, I think at the time he was the one who was the head of the astronaut office, and a couple of other astronauts. And anyway, they called me to this meeting to let me know that there was it was about time to go pick up a couple of our astronauts from Kazakhstan coming home from the space station, and there was a problem with one of the engines on the Gulf Stream that we needed to go pick them up in, and they weren't sure they were going to be able to get a part in time to repair it. So it was kind of becoming an emergency, and so they asked me, for help. And so one of the things they asked me to be prepared to do was to charter an airplane if we couldn't fix the Gulf Stream on time, and also it was that I think prompted them to start thinking about, maybe we ought to just go ahead and buy a newer Gulfstream with the longer range. And so anyway, so that was kind of a little bit unnerving to think, wow, okay, how the heck do I charter an airplane to go to Kazakhstan? And so thank goodness the part was available in time to repair the airplane, and they were able to go use that Gulfstream to go pick up our astronauts, and it turned out to not be necessary to have to charter an airplane. But I did end up just a year or two later actually being what they call the source selection official to select in a competition a new Gulfstream 5 airplane that was used to go retrieve our astronauts from Kazakhstan. That was one of the last things I did about 6 months before. Well, actually, no, only about 3 or 4 months before I retired. So, yeah, I think that was one of the times where I don't know if exciting is the right word, but yeah, certainly got my attention.
I know the last Gulfstream that came back, it was kind of interesting to watch, given the activities that are going on in Russia and in Ukraine, the Gulfstream path back to the States, because it overflew neither of those two countries. It came out of Kazakhstan and avoided both Ukraine and Russia on the way back.
Yeah.
So
yeah. Well, so that makes me think of reminds me of part of the whole discussion about which airplane to buy, and they told me, okay, so a Gulfstream 5 could fly nonstop from Kazakhstan back to Houston, but to do that, it would have to fly over the North Pole. And it took me for a while to, think about that. And I thought, oh, yeah, that's right. If you're headed over to, Europe and the Atlantic, that's completely different than just going more directly over the North Pole. The catch was that they didn't want to fly over the North Pole. And so they ended up, and I can't remember now if it was Scotland or Finland, they decided to head that way and make that one stop in one of those countries.
Yeah, the last time it was Germany. The last flight back on Gulfstream
somewhere
was
in
Germany.
that.
Yeah. I think of the Air Force Base there in Germany.
Mm-hmm.
So let me see if I can get this to work. So I'm going to do this. And I'm going to bring up this one.
Hello, Herb. What are the requirements to do this? Do you need anything in aerospace engineering, physics? What do you need to do this?
So that's a question from Sunset. So I'm going to let you take that question.
Okay, you're cutting out, and really pretty much all I heard was, what is it required to do this? I didn't really catch what it required to do what.
Well, I think to work at NASA, I think is what he's asking.
Oh, okay. Well, so I already touched on that a little bit, right? Certainly, most people think of working at NASA in the area of an astronaut, which is everyone knows that's really hard to be selected for. But otherwise, mostly engineers and a lot of scientists, and a fair number of doctors as well. But other than that, like I said, uh, 30 to 40% were people like me. I had a business degree,
Mhm.
and finance and HR and IT and social media and any number of other food preparation. There's any number of things that jobs that are required to that NASA needs to have done, and even more than I mentioned. Of course, a lot of them uh, are not jobs where you're actually a NASA employee. Uh, uh, the Johnson Space Center is probably a good example. And for there, at least when I left, there were about 3,000, 3,500 NASA employees, civil servants, but there were about 12 or 13,000 contractors,
Hmm.
working for other companies, aerospace companies and other companies, security, the guards that run the gate didn't work for NASA. They work for a company that NASA contracted with to provide security services, and that's just one example. But so yeah, I guess I would encourage anyone who's interested in the space industry. Don't be discouraged and think, oh my gosh, engineering or science isn't really my thing. I have no chance to work at NASA or contractors supporting NASA. That's just not true. There's lots and lots of opportunities to do other things to support space exploration.
So, what would you tell? Let's say you had someone in high school. Say you're speaking to a high school group. What would you tell someone in high school about preparing if they wanted to work for NASA or even wanted to become an astronaut? What would you tell them to do?
Well, and this probably sounds like the kind of thing you would expect someone to say, but uh, work hard, right, and do the things you need to do to learn what you should be learning, and that goes for middle school and high school and college. Uh, and what that needs to lead to is to uh, have something that you I hate to say that you're passionate about, but that you enjoy doing. And so typically, if you have a job that you enjoy doing or are interested in, you're more likely to be more successful or better at it. And that's, I think, one of the things that, at least in my experience, that the people who do the hiring for NASA and certainly with astronauts are looking for. It's people who have shown accomplishments and ability to do a good job and to work hard, and so yeah. Hopefully that makes sense.
Hmm. Um, why don't you tell us your favorite story from the Apollo era, the Apollo series?
Oh, okay. I do have one,
Okay.
and so I started my professional career at NASA in 1975. So the Apollo program had just ended a couple of years before. That was just after the Apollo Soyuz mission in 1974, I think. But I grew up in the area here, and so I just, one of I feel so lucky about that. My parents just happened to move to a place where a couple of years later they decided to build the Manned Spacecraft Center, which became the Johnson Space Center. And so all of a sudden I'm in middle school. I'm 10 years old or something like that, maybe a teenager, and they opened the Manned Spacecraft Center, and the first two classes of astronauts had been selected by then, and so they and their families all moved into my community, and so I'm friends and classmates with the the kids of all of the first two classes of astronauts. I played on the seventh grade football team with Fred Borman and Jay Carpenter, Scott Carpenter's son and Frank Borman's son, and then all through the rest of middle school and high school, became friends with many of the other astronauts kids who were my age. So anyway, all of that just to say that I grew up in the area here, and so back in those early Apollo days, 1960 lunar landing days at least, uh, Apollo 11, 12, 13. I was 17 years old in 1969, and so the way the TV networks covered those Apollo lunar landing missions is that their studios were in New York City, so they would fly crews down from New York and set up a studio. It was basically a mobile home, a trailer on site at the Manned Spacecraft Center, and they would bring in their camera and a backdrop and a desk and bring in astronauts and flight directors and such to interview. And so they needed someone, because back then, this was before videotape or the internet, of course, 1969. And so they needed, whenever they filmed an interview with someone, you had to physically move that film from Houston to New York to their studios to be able to broadcast it on network TV. And so they were looking for a local person who knew their way around Houston to twice a day. This was my main job. They hired me for to drive that film to Intercontinental Airport, which was about 100-mile round trip, to drop the film off to be put on an airplane to fly to New York. And so again, I did that twice a day, and I worked Apollo 11, Apollo 12, Apollo 13. I was in and then Apollo. Oh, had gone to college during Apollo 14, but then I came back and worked Apollo 15 again. And so anyway, for Apollo 12, this is the story I like. A local Houston TV station wanted a local human interest story. So this was not something that needed to be filmed and have the film flown to New York. So they sent me and a cameraman to Pete Conrad's home near the Manned Spacecraft Center to film his family in their living room, watching on their TV as Apollo 12 splashed down at the end of the mission. And so, of course, Pete Conrad was the third guy to walk on the moon. And so I was there in his home with his family in their living room with the cameraman, filming the family watching the splashdown of the capsule at the end of the Apollo 12 mission. And I still remember it like it was yesterday. It was, 53 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
The cameraman taking the film out of the camera, put the camera in a black bag so it wasn't exposed to light, handing me the film, put it in a canister. And this was about 3:00 in the afternoon. And the local TV station was anxious to get this in time for the 5, 6 o'clock news. And of course, back then they had to process the film, and it took longer back then than it does today to prepare for something like that. And so rather than have me drive the film to the TV station, which would have been about a 30-minute drive, there was a helicopter waiting for me when I drove from Pete Conrad's house back to across the street from the Manned Spacecraft Center. And so I remember getting in that helicopter. I'm 17 years old. I've never been in a helicopter before, just a little 2-seater thing. And we're flying down the freeway barely above the power lines. And I remember the guy telling me, I just came back from flying missions in Vietnam. And again, this was 1969. And so anyway, my adrenaline was really going. And so I even remember him landing the helicopter, there was no heliport there. So I had to run across, 4 or 5 lanes of traffic. And I remember walking into the TV studio, and there was a woman waiting for me. And so I remember handing her the film in the canister. And I don't remember anything after that. It was just like, all the adrenaline just drained completely out of my body. I don't even remember the helicopter ride back home. But so anyway, that's one of my favorite stories about the Apollo days.
Okay, so you came in 75, so you saw the golden age of the shuttle. So tell us about the lead up. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so I had worked a couple of years, again, starting in about 1975. And one of the first, the first couple of years, I was just learning how to do the job. And the first project I worked on was EMU, the Extravehicular Mobility Unit, which is a fancy name for a spacesuit. And so Hamilton, back then it was called Hamilton Standard in Windsor Locks, Connecticut. That was actually my very first government official travel, was to a meeting at Hamilton Standard in Connecticut to talk with have a meeting about the spacesuit development. But by 1979, so this was 2 years before the first shuttle flight, I had been moved to the shuttle orbiter procurement section. So I was on a team of about, I don't know, there were 6 or 8 of us, and we were managing the contract with Rockwell to build the space shuttle orbiter vehicles. And so I still have, this was a gift that, I don't know if you can read it.
I can see it. There we go.
Yeah, Rockwell International gave me for being part of that team. And so, that was, I mean, really cool for me getting to buy the space shuttle orbiter vehicles. And of course, so that's this, obviously. And you may know there was a different contract for the external tank, and even another different contract for the solid rocket boosters, and then even another separate contract for the turn it around, the shuttle main engines. But so one of the interesting things, this is an old model because the external tank is white. And so you may know that with the STS-1 and STS-2, that the external tank was full of super cool liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. And they thought they needed to paint it white to help protect it from the ultraviolet rays of the sun to keep it cool. But after the first 2 shuttle flights, they realized that they didn't have to paint the external tank white after all, and so they stopped doing that, and it saved 600. I can't remember now if it was 600 gallons or 600 pounds of paint, and so it was, I think, for the last 133 flights. Oh, okay, that makes more sense. Yeah, the external tank was orange, of course, its natural color, for the last 133 flights.
So tell us about the STS-1 launch and where you were, and what were your emotions around the STS-1 launch?
Well, so an interesting thing about that was, and a lot of people may not remember unless you were there in the middle of it, there was just delay after delay after delay. And so in fact, I remember I don't have a copy with me, but I still remember, and I saved a copy. I remember walking in to the office one morning and got on the elevator, and there was somebody had printed a calendar, and it said, "We will launch this," and this was like in February, I guess, of 1981, and it said, "We will launch in March 1981." And if you looked at the calendar, it said January, February, March, 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 March. And of course, even then we didn't make it. It was April 12th before the first launch. So in some ways, and again, some people had been working on it many, many more years than me. I'd only been working on it for a couple of years, but in some ways it was a sense of relief, not only because, we finally made it, but also, some people I think don't think about the fact that the shuttle had never launched before. We had done the approach and landing test where, it was on the back of a 747 and was released and would, fly and land testing the approach and landing, but it had never, with people in it, well, with or without people, had never been launched with the main engines and the external tanks and such. And so the fact that John Young and Bob Crippen, and they wanted to, nobody had to twist their arm to get them to be the commander and pilot for that. And that still just kind of blows my mind, and how risky that was. who knows what could have happened with that thing, and of course it all worked out fine. But I think there were a lot of, and of course, as we all know, throughout the program, we lost 2 of those shuttles, and so
Right.
it was clearly a very complicated and dangerous machine. And so I just have, the utmost respect for those 2 guys, John Young and Bob Crippen, to sit in that thing that had never flown before and go through that STS-1 mission. I do have even. Yeah. One of my favorite mementos is they gave me it's
I can see it.
a little piece of the one of the shuttle tiles for contributing to that STS, one of the part of the tile that flew on that first STS-1
STS-1.
mission. Yeah. So that, this is one of my favorite mementos.
Cool. Yeah, that's one of the things that is just amazing. You think about Doug Hurley and Bob Behnken, right? They just got on Crew Dragon last year.
Yep.
And they took before flown.
Yeah, I think has it been 2 years yet? Yeah, but no, same kind of thing. Yeah. Right. But at least the Dragon had been launched and flown without without people in it. Again, the shuttle had never done anything but take off the back of a 747 and come in and land. It had never taken off with all of that power, sitting on basically a atomic bomb.
Now a lot of the delays for STS-1 were hydrogen leaks, if at all.
Actually, the tiles.
Very similar.
Yeah. Many of the launch pad delays, but I think one of the biggest contributors to the delay in the program itself, to finally getting to that STS-1 launch, was problems. They were having problems that they hadn't expected with the tiles coming loose on the underside of the shuttle back in 79, 80, and early part of 81 before they finally got that all sorted out.
Yeah, so they were doing loose the vibrations from going out.
I
things like
think
that.
any number of things. Yeah.
Then I think back to the shuttle era and how much they struggled with containing liquid hydrogen and fueled, and then we had that very, very similar thing that occurred with Artemis 1. And what I'm amazed about is that NASA went back and contracted and brought some of those old shuttle guys back in to help consult on the Artemis 1 launch so they could help resolve those issues.
Yeah, well, and of course you probably know that some of those RS-25 engines that there were 4 on Artemis were reused shuttle, the engines that flew on the space shuttle, and the solid rocket boosters are just kind of similar, updated with an extra piece. Yeah, so clearly there was some similarities in those 2 launch vehicles.
Yes. Tell us about the Challenger accident. We've talked about that we lost 2 shuttles. The first one was Challenger, 1986, if I recall.
January.
Tell me about where you were and what you went through with the Challenger accident.
Yeah, so you're right. That I happened to have been sent to NASA headquarters on a special assignment, a 1-year detail, they called it. I was I went up there in February of 1985, and so my year was to end at the end of January in 1986. I was the oh gosh, it was a space station related job. User cost manager was my title. And again, this is 1986, well, 85 and 86, you know, 13 years, 12, 13 years before we actually flew. So that was very, very early in the program. But anyway, yeah, so I obviously remember it well. In fact, that week, I had a, you know, it was going to be my last week at NASA headquarters, and as is typical in most places you work, they had planned a going away party for me on that Friday. And I think it was I think January 26th may have been a Tuesday. I think it was Challenger. And so we had flown, I don't remember now, you know, 25 flights or something like that. And I don't believe, so I was at NASA headquarters in Washington, DC, but I don't believe I don't believe I was even watching it on TV, if you can believe that, you know, because it had become, you know, fairly routine, and we expected everything to go well. And then when it didn't, if you can imagine, of all places, the feeling of people working at NASA headquarters, and you know, the first accident, well, in the first loss of life and anything like that since the Apollo 1 fire in 1967, I think. And so, you know, it was horrible. I mean, you know, I remember walking the halls and people were just, you know, like zombies. You didn't know what to say or what to do, and just this, you know, awful feeling. You know, I'm sure many people were thinking, "Gosh, you know," and initially no one knew what caused it. You know, it took a little while to figure out, and you know, gosh, was there's something I could have done, or you know, how did this happen? And so it was just, well, I would say of 42 years, it was the worst, hardest work day of my entire career. And so anyway,
Wow.
they was talking about my going away party. They canceled my going away party that at the end of that week because no one felt like celebrating anything for a while. But yeah, and then and of course, President Reagan came and gave a speech at the Johnson Space Center
Yeah.
here. Yeah,
Yeah,
so
that'd be a tough time, and I'm sure it's tough to even remember that day.
yeah,
It's been
you know, it's
okay.
still, well, you see if something will pop up on TV or YouTube or something. I don't even want to watch.
Right.
Yeah, yeah, and of
Yeah.
course they, you know, all people that worked with us and in the community. And in fact, so Laurel Clark was one of the astronauts that died, and her son. My wife was a librarian at a local private school here where he went to school, and so you know, one of the astronauts that was killed, my wife taught his son or her son.
Hmm. That had to be tough.
Yeah, it was
Yeah,
tough.
and so it was tough. I can't imagine. Um, Tell us then a little bit. Where were you where I was during Columbia? Because I was actually on my back porch
Mm,
watching Columbia streak over
yeah, yeah,
that day,
yeah,
and so I literally saw with my own eyes what occurred that day.
yeah,
Where were you during the
yeah.
Columbia accident?
So that was a Saturday morning, which,
Mhm.
you know, there's nothing good about it. But I've always thought, you know, thank goodness that it wasn't a work day for many of us. Although lots of people obviously ended up working for several days in a row without, you know, forget the fact that it was the weekend. But I was not one of them. I didn't have to go back to the office till Monday. So, and I say that because at least as opposed to the Challenger with Columbia, I had a couple of days to kind of, you know, process it a little bit before I had to show up in the office with, you know, my coworkers and such. But so anyway, I was at home, and watching on TV or listening on the radio, something like that. And as soon as I saw or heard what was happening, I knew, oh, that's not good. This is
Yeah.
this is not good. Um,
I turned on
um,
the local news channel, and they were actually covering it flying over. And so I went out
oh,
on the
okay,
back
yeah,
porch to watch it there. And when I came back in, and I saw what happened, right? And so I came back in to the into my
hmm
home, and the local news channel had cut away. They just they didn't even
oh
talk
yeah,
about it any longer
yeah,
until there's official
yeah,
news
yeah, yeah,
out of out of NASA.
yeah,
Um, yeah, so
yeah.
that's those are tough times. Space. You hear people say the little phrase. Bill Nelson says it all the time. Space is hard, right? But that's a very factual
Yeah,
statement. You're getting on a
yeah,
basically a
yeah,
controlled explosion,
yeah,
and then somehow you've got to come back. You've got to lose 17,500 miles per hour
yeah,
coming back through the atmosphere
yeah,
to land, and
yeah, and
and
yeah,
all that is difficult.
yeah, yeah. And so, in fact,
Um,
I was working in the Space Shuttle Program Office at the time, and I was the contracting officer for the contract NASA had with United Space Alliance to provide the shuttle processing, and so I ended up being fairly heavily involved in the investigation. I had to provide information and talk with the Columbia Accident Investigation Board, and in fact, it just happens that the 20th anniversary of that Columbia accident is in a couple of months, next February 1st, and so there's a museum in Sabine County, Texas, East Texas, where actually that's the county where all of the astronauts uh, landed, and many other parts of the shuttle, of course. And so they ended up building a museum there, and so they're having a 3-day event there, and they've invited me to come participate on a panel on that day. So I'm kind of looking forward to doing that. I haven't been to the museum yet, so looking forward to finally seeing that and participating in that event. And let me back up a little bit. I think I'm realizing I was talking about Laurel Clark, one of the astronauts. I think she died in Columbia, not Challenger.
right.
Yeah, yeah. So
Yeah.
my
Um,
story about the Challenger. Uh, oh, let's go ahead. Yeah,
it's okay. It's okay. Um, so you left in 2016. Commercial crew had already been signed. Commercial cargo had been successful by then.
yeah. Well, yeah. So, but I was involved back now. So this is the very beginning in 2006. I was working in what was then the Constellation program, which and part of that program
Mm-hmm.
was Orion and the what's now SLS. And so, as part of that, at least the responsibility for that office, the Commercial Orbital Transportation Services, which was a new program where NASA was, yeah, COTS, yeah, to
Mm-hmm.
provide seed money to commercial companies. Because again, this is 2005, 2006. There were no commercial space flight companies, at least that were doing anything serious. And so NASA said, "Hey, we've got what was it, $500 million, and we want all of you companies out there that think you might be successful or interested in building your own spacecraft that could take crew and cargo back and forth to low Earth orbit, to submit a proposal, and we'll pick the best ones and provide you, some piece of this $500 million of seed money." and so I got to be involved in that. And we two of the companies, if we found three or four that we really liked and thought were worth investing in, we would have picked more. But there were only two, uh, and one of them was SpaceX. And so, and not me personally, but a guy I was working for ended up negotiating it was called a Space Act agreement, not a contract, with SpaceX. I still have
Mm-hmm.
a copy of the page of the signature page of that Space Act agreement that Elon Musk signed in June of 2006. Um,
Wow, that's cool.
and yeah, I think that was 16 years ago. And
Eh,
to be honest, back then in 2006, when we were doing that, and so what it ended up uh, whenever that first Crew Dragon with Bob and Doug flew was 2020, I think. I I never
right,
thought that it
May
would be
2020.
14 years. Yeah, at the time, thinking back, I don't, if you had told me it's going to be 14 years before we've, one of these companies that you choose flies people, I would have thought, oh God, I hope it doesn't take that long. I mean, because think back to comparing it to Apollo. The Apollo 1 fire. Well, or whenever you want to, start the Apollo
Mm-hmm.
program, Kennedy's speech and 62 or whenever it was, and 7 years later we have people walking on the moon, and here it was 14 years before we were able to fly two guys to the space station in the COTS program.
Now, to be fair, the COTS program only included cargo initially,
Well,
and it
well, yeah,
wasn't
well, no, but the plan from the beginning was to eventually get
what.
to crew. But you're right. All the emphasis and all of the work. You're right. That's a good point. Was okay. Let's figure out how to do the cargo first, and then we'll work on the crew.
Okay.
And actually, I
Okay.
don't want to sound like I'm complaining. That's it worked out very well, and I've been very very impressed with SpaceX and what they've accomplished, and that whole business of landing those rockets, after and reusing them still just kind of blows my mind. I never dreamed that we would be able to do something like that.
Yeah, and I think they signed the commercial crew program, if I'm recalling right, about 2014. So it took them 6 years, but that's still
Yeah,
it's still
yeah,
a long time. Um,
yeah,
it's still a long time because you're
yeah,
basically talking capsule technology, something that
yeah,
the Russians and we had done already,
yeah.
and so it still took 6 years. What's even more amazing to me is Boeing's contract was signed at exactly the same time. Their Starliner program.
Right, and I still don't know if there's a scheduled launch date for their first crewed flight.
Okay, there's and we are getting some questions in. I'll read them to you
Yeah.
because I can't pull them up
Okay.
on the overlay, but as they come
Yeah.
in, I'll let you know. Um, but yeah, I'm sure Boeing Starliner's got an approximate date, right? They don't have a solid date, but they're supposed to be second quarter next year, is
Okay.
what the
I
time frame is.
I did remember hearing something about a planned date at some point in the future, but I couldn't even remember. It was so far out that I couldn't even remember, when it was.
So here from Chad, I have a question. It says, other than Apollo 11, what was your favorite Apollo mission and why? I talked about Apollo
Yeah.
12.
Yeah.
So,
So,
but personally, what was your favorite
oh yeah.
Apollo
So
mission?
that's actually an easy one for me. It was Apollo 8. Again, that was the first with the Borman, Lovell, and Anders. That was the first time that humans traveled to another celestial body.
Right.
And so leaving low Earth orbit, and that's it kind of makes me think of the way I feel about the STS-1 launch. It's just like, wow,
Right.
those guys. Whoa.
Have you seen? Did you see the pictures coming back from the
Yeah,
STS-1 launch of the moon kind of eclipsed Earth, and that was just those are just
yeah,
gorgeous shots.
yeah, yeah.
Now from Finn Trukey, there he's from Johannes in Finland.
Mhm.
He says, "What does it feel like to have a new bird up there just about to come back from the moon?" So he's talking about Artemis 1.
Oh, it's
What do you feel? How does that feel?
oh, it feels wonderful. I mean, again, here I was around and old enough to remember well, and those first lunar missions. I was 17 at the time of Apollo 11, and I've been so, even though I'm not working for NASA anymore, so excited and interested in Artemis. I was invited. I watched the Artemis 1 launch from Mission Control at the Johnson Space Center.
Hmm.
At whatever here it was 1:30 or something like that in the morning. There's no way I was going to miss that. So, in fact, back I was talking about working in what was then called the Constellation program before it ended up being canceled, although Orion and SLS survived. Uh, I had been assigned to support the office that was going to, where NASA was going to build or have built the new lunar lander. And so then
Hmm.
when the Constellation program was canceled, obviously that piece of it was too. And I was just, devastated. It's kind of a strong word, but
Bummed.
you bummed. Yeah, definitely bummed. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, I am just, there's not many people probably around that are happier than me to see us going back to the moon again for the first time in 50 years. Yeah, very excited about that.
Good. Cool. Here's another question from Casey, and he's from Germany. He says, "Who were the most impressive personalities that at Johnson Space Center apart from astronauts?"
Oh, wow.
So, who were the
Uh,
impressive personalities at Johnson Space Center apart from astronauts?
yeah, I don't think I've ever gotten that question. That's an interesting question. Um, I guess I hate to try to name, any specific individuals, but well, no, okay. Now, the more I think about it, I think the better answer I'm getting. So apart from the astronauts, I guess it would be the flight directors, like Gene Kranz and Glenn Lundy and
Oh, cool.
those guys. And so I got to become friends with Gene Kranz and his. I worked for one of his daughters, Lucy, uh, for a while. She was working in the space station. When I came back from NASA headquarters, she was my boss. In fact, kind of a almost embarrassing, funny story. I had been at NASA headquarters for 9 or 10 years, and I came back and was told that I would be working in this space station office, and Lucy Yates was my boss, and so I guess everyone just assumed I would know, but I'd been gone for 10 years, and when I left, she wasn't working here, and so I didn't know, but that her maiden name was Kranz, and that she
Mm.
was Jean Kranz's daughter. So you can imagine one day I went into her office there, and the door was closed, and I asked, the secretary, "Hey, is Lucy busy?" And she said, the secretary said, "Yeah, she's in there with her father." And of course, I thought, "Oh, that's kind of weird for someone's father to come during the middle of the day." And she said, "Well, he's been in there for a while. They'll probably be done pretty quickly." And so I thought, well, okay, I'll hang around for a second. And the door opened and Gene Kranz walked out. And oh my gosh, why didn't someone tell me that you were Gene Kranz's daughter? And I felt
Yeah.
really stupid for not knowing that. But again, I guess everyone else who had been there for a while knew it, but they didn't think to tell me. And so anyway, yeah, I got to meet with him several times, and even got to meet and chat with Glenn Lunny several times. Another one of the very early flight directors. So I guess I would have to say those guys would probably be the most impressive personalities that I met at the Johnson Space Center.
That's cool. I'm going to ask the next question, but I'm going to kind of start with Artemis, and then the next question is from Kevin Lay. It says, when do you think people will land on Mars? I'm going to start with, when do you think people will land on the moon? When do you think we're returning? The official statement of when we were supposed to. Do you think we're returning to the moon?
Yeah, 2025, right? The Artemis 2, as of the latest schedule I remember, Artemis 2, which is a crewed flight but not landing on the moon.
24.
Early, spring of 2024. And then I don't know that a specific month was given, but I think I remember saying that sometime in 2025, maybe late 2025, is the planned date for actually having boots on the ground, as they like to say, on the moon.
Right.
So did you want me to answer the question?
When do you think?
Yeah, when do I think people will land on Mars?
Yeah, why don't you take a crack at that question now?
So, I guess you'd probably get a different answer from just about everybody, depending on who you ask. So what I think about that is that there are still so many difficult problems, technology issues to be solved that I'm not aware have been solved yet, that it's hard for me to guess. It's going to be a long time. If I had to guess, and again, my frame of reference being, okay, we awarded, and although it's more complicated than that, talking about earlier awarding this contract, the COTS Space Act agreement to SpaceX in 2006, and 16 or 14 years later, before just flying to low Earth orbit, I would guess 20 years, before we have anybody walking on Mars, and part of that, the radiation. Yeah. And part of that is the radiation issue. They still, there's no solution for the exposure that the astronauts would have on a trip that long, out that far in deep space, to the radiation they would get. In fact, that's one of the things they're testing on Artemis 1 here. There's a mannequin called, they call it Moonikin. Maybe you know all of this, sitting in the full size, whatever 5'10", 6 foot mannequin called Moonikin, that's sitting in the commander or pilot seat, that with all kinds of sensors to evaluate the stresses and things that mannequin feels during the flight. And they're also they're just torsos, they're not the full body, that are simulating women's bones and tissues and organs and things. And one of them has on, again, they're testing something out, some type of protective cover against radiation. So one has it and one doesn't. And so that's one of the things that they will hopefully, gain some knowledge from during the Artemis 1 mission, is how well whatever it is they're using over that one torso to protect from radiation works as compared to the one without it. So I'm kind of interested to see how that comes out myself too. But even other things like what vehicle are we going to use to go to Mars? And I honestly, I don't think it's going to be Orion. I think they're going to need a bigger vehicle than Orion for a trip that long. And things like food and water. There's still, I know there are lots of people working on things like that. Growing food in space. Because people say, well, how long does it take to get to Mars? And well, the answer is, well, it depends on when you leave. Because of the orbits. But I think even if you leave at the optimal time, which is like 6 months is about
Right.
the shortest trip.
Yeah, I think the current NASA plan calls for like a 6-month journey there, a 30-day
Yeah.
venture on the
Or-
surface, and then a 6-month return, which is right at the maximum of time that humans are able to tolerate zero
Yeah.
gravity, right?
Oh, yeah.
So you're
Yeah.
really talking about right now the maximum amount of time that humans can tolerate zero gravity. So I have another question about space Starship. And before I go to that question, what's going on in Boca Chica? And do you watch all the streams that are available, or any of the streams that are available down there? And
No, to be honest, I don't. I mean, again, I casually read about that, but I'm not following it nearly as closely as what NASA's doing with Artemis. And I mean, I live in Texas, so some people who live even closer than me have have driven down there to see it in person, but I haven't done that.
well, some of the astronauts have flown in, and they've flown their T-38s to Brownsville
Yeah.
and drove over
Yeah.
and toured the facility. It's just a different phenomenon I think we've ever seen, and that's dealing with the fact that cameras, it's no more the rocket. I went down and saw it myself. The rocket was than 2 football fields from the rocket. So unlike like Launch Complex 39A, where the closest you could get is to the rocket
About 3 miles.
as a common, as a public person. The closest you get about 3 miles. There, you're talking a couple hundred yards from the rocket.
Yeah.
And so what you have is cameras that are set up all around it on that state highway. They're just left there by YouTubers, as they call us, and they film it. So I'm sure you've heard Elon's spiel for going to Mars. What do you think about that?
Well, again, I think he's very, very much overly optimistic.
Okay.
Hey, if he's got a plan that he think will work and he can convince somebody that it's safe to do that, more power to him. But I'm not really believing it much myself.
Yeah. Even his fans, his hardcore fans, call his timelines Elon time. So they've kind of labeled it as Elon time.
Yeah.
And
Hey, and again, don't get me wrong. I would love to see it happen in my lifetime.
Yeah, me too.
But and I could be totally wrong, but I just think there's too many too hard problems that haven't been solved yet for that to happen in the next 5 or 10 years.
Well,
And I'd be very happy to be wrong.
Yeah, and well, I think using Starship as a human lander is nearly amazing. If there's any leap that we have in actually establishing a lunar base, it's going to be a lander that can land tons of materials, not a small amount. Right now, NASA's plan is to launch, I think, in 2032 or 10 years from now, a module that on SLS that is uncrewed, so it'll be a cargo launch with a module that'll land that will be a complete habitat that'll land in the South Pole area in 10 years. So
Yeah,
that's one of the
on the moon,
on the moon.
right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
it'll be a
yeah,
30-day habitat for the moon,
yeah, yeah, yeah. Well,
and
that's right. And,
and they give us like approximately 2040 for the Mars landing, but
mhm.
I've seen, at least my vision or my view of NASA is the Mars mission is always about 15 years away, whether it's 1980 or 1990 or 2000 or 2010 or
Mhm, mhm.
2020. The
Yeah,
Mars mission is
yeah,
always about 15 years
yeah,
away.
yeah. Well, and I think what you were just describing too, I think that's the only way you're going to be successful having people or a group of people land on Mars is to send to pre-position uh, food, materials, habitats, whatever
Right.
they're on earlier flights, that are uncrewed, so that it's already
Did,
there when you actually have people landing there.
did you watch the Matt Damon movie, The Martian?
Oh yeah,
Have you
yeah,
watched
yeah,
that
yeah,
movie
yeah.
yet?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
But
I watched it twice. They had a special showing of it for NASA employees here. Yeah, the guy who wrote the book, he came and spoke. I got a signed copy of his Martian book, and again, they while he was here, they had a special showing of the movie just for NASA employees, and so I went to see that, and then I went to see it again.
good. Well, to me that gives a sample of what, and even though that, I watched some reviews of it that said that wasn't a realistic space show movie because there's a lot of things that were just unrealistic about it. But there's a lot of things that are well thought out in that movie as well, right? Right, the
Oh,
preposition
yeah,
supplies, the
yeah, yeah,
preposition
oh,
return vehicles,
yeah.
was well thought out.
Oh yeah.
But
Well,
like the
yeah.
what
No, I was just going to
said
say.
was the fact that
Yeah, I would actually
go ahead, I might
disagree
not
with anybody who said it
you
was
heard me.
totally unrealistic because in fact they worked uh, very very closely with NASA to make it as realistic as possible. I mean, obviously the spaceship they were flying back and forth was way into the future, but otherwise, in fact, I think I remember the author saying something like the most unrealistic thing about the movie for him was the sandstorm at the beginning because there was never be enough wind for that to actually happen. But he said, "Hey, that's my story in my book, so that I decided that's what I was going to write." But otherwise, he
Yeah.
tried to. I mean, within reason, and projecting 20, 30 years into the future, he tried to make it as realistic as possible.
Well, now, have you watched the latest docudrama on Coffee Goodbye? Have you watched that one on Prime Video?
No, 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 I haven't.
That's a very well done movie. It's got Steven Squires in it, and the entire or the original and later supporters of Spirit and Opportunity on Mars, and they talk about some of their challenges. Like they lost Spirit simply because there's a dust storm that covered the planet for 2 whole months, and
Hmm.
when the dust storm ended, finally, it just Spirit didn't come back. Um,
Oh yeah,
so
yeah,
so anyway, it's been an hour, and we talked about talking with you for an hour this evening.
yeah.
Is there anything
Boy, time
you want to
flies
say
when you're
to
having fun.
young people before we go? Yes, it does. Is there anything you want to say to young people
Oh well,
before we
yeah,
go
yeah,
that are considering?
yeah, yeah. I guess the first thing that comes to mind, and I don't know that I touched on this before, but don't be afraid to fail or don't try just because you think you may not be successful or because this company, NASA or some contractor wouldn't want someone like me to work there. I what's the phrase? Everything you want is on the other side of fear. Go for it. Again,
Yes.
I don't know an easier way to say it than don't be afraid to try. and fail. And in fact,
Yes.
this is one of the, speaking of Gene Kranz and the movie Apollo 13, he's famous for saying failure is not an option. And of course, he didn't actually say that. It was a line written for the movie, but he kind of took it. And in fact, he named his book, and the way he signs thing now is failure is not an option. And I say, well, that's fine if you're the lives of 3 astronauts you're trying to bring home are at stake. But otherwise, if I'm sure you've heard this before, if you're not failing, you're not trying hard enough. So anyway, it's,
Right. Well,
and I know that's easier said
fine.
than done, but that would be my advice.
Okay. Well, you have a good evening, and I think I've got at least another dozen questions I could have asked you, and so maybe we'll have a Herb Baker. Sound good? Maybe a few more months.
I'm up for it. Just let me know when you're ready. We'll do it.
And maybe we'll do it in person. I'll come down to Houston, and you're in the Houston area, right?
Yeah. I'm just a few miles from the
We'll
Johnson
just
Space
do that.
Center.
We'll do it. Okay. Super.
That would be awesome. Yeah.
I will. Maybe I'll make a trip down there in about 6 months, and we'll just do this live, and we'll be in the same room together.
Yeah.
Sounds
that
good.
would be great.
Yeah.
Okay.
Have a good evening.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
You too, Lane. I enjoyed it. Right. Bye.